Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Hail State Debate. My name is Brett Harvey. I have our ace debaters Josh McCoy and Alicia Brown here with me as always. And we are here for the inaugural first ever November-December public forum topic, which is...
The United States federal government should impose price controls on the pharmaceutical industry.
So we're talking pharmaceuticals here. We're talking about price controls. We're talking a lot about economics. We're doing a pretty deep dive. So what we're going to do today is we're going to follow the usual order that we follow. We're going to give some initial thoughts on the resolution. Then we're going to move to do framework and sort of concepts as well as definitions to sort of set up the specifics and the contention level stuff. Then next we'll move to the contentions. And then finally we'll do some parting thoughts. As always, we're going to put the timestamps for all the different sections down in the notes below. So if you want to jump around or skip around, if you want to do a little bit at a time, that's fine. You can do that. We're also going to put links to all of the sources that we cite and maybe a few other things as well in the notes. So hopefully that'll be useful to you. If it is useful, maybe give us a like, maybe subscribe. Maybe tell a friend. We certainly want to help as many folks as we can. Hopefully we're being helpful. And if there's something you want to know, ask us in the comments because we certainly try to be as responsive as we can to that.
And also, if there's anything that we need to change or something you think would be an improvement for our channel, let us know and we'll try to accommodate that or see if that's something we'd be interested in like pursuing in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. If you've got suggestions or stuff, please do let us know. So with that, I think what we'll do is offer some initial thoughts kind of on the resolution. And then just kind of make our way through the video. So my thoughts on the resolution are, I actually like it. You know, I think it's a pretty good resolution. I don't think it's perfect, but I think it's a nice change of pace. When you compare it to the other choice that we had, which would have been doing yet another debate about like a national healthcare system, which is huge and broad and unwieldy, I think it's fairly specific, and I like that. You know, when you compare it to the topic that we had in September, October, the law of the sea, you know, like we talked about there, that was a topic that could take you all over the world to all different kinds of impacts and theories and you know, sort of different ways of arguing it. I actually think that this one really focuses very heavily, I think, on a very specific conflict, right? Whereas UNCLOS, the law of the sea, could be about Russia, it could be about China, it could be about mining, it could be anything, right? In this one, I think that you are really focusing, honestly, overwhelmingly on a single conflict between price of pharmaceuticals and innovation in pharmaceuticals. You know, I think that at the end of the day, what this debate is about in the real world, and I think in the vast majority of rounds, is going to be, you know, are we willing to sacrifice some innovation, potential innovation in the future in order to lower the cost of pharmaceuticals? And I think because of that, you're going to be doing, frankly, round after round after round in which you are, you know, basically trying to hash out, you know, whether or not we're willing to do that. And if you had a resolution that was really specific, like, for example, you know, which team was better, the 2001 Miami Hurricanes or the 1995 Nebraska Cornhuskers?
You can look at very specific empirics to determine your answer.
You're going to have,
off of that.
Right, you're going to have to be ready and know everything about like the Nebraska Cornhuskers and the Miami Hurricanes, their roster, their coaches, their statistics. And I think the same thing is true here. You're going to have a very deep knowledge of how the pharmaceutical industry works, of how patents work and generics work and how monopoly economics work and things along those lines.
But the good thing is, because this is 2 months long and you're going to be seeing a lot of the same arguments over and over and over and over again, you're going to learn really quickly the ins and outs of this topic. And most likely, and especially something that I picked up during PF, I'm sure Alicia, you did the same thing, was that you'll find new arguments that like your opponent brings up during the round that you're gonna be like, I really like that. I'm gonna look that up a little bit more and maybe add that to my case.
Yeah, I think maybe the key sort of skill to emphasize here is gonna be the word explaining, right? I do not think this is a topic where you can sort of run away and find very many quality impacts, like esoteric, unusual impacts that people haven't thought of. I don't think this is a topic where you can effectively win by ambush. You know, I think you're going to have to sort of square up, know the economic theory, like know about how incentives work, know about how investment in research and development works, know how patents work, and be able to square up and have really good data and be able to explain it. You're going to have to look a judge in the eye who's never heard this before and not just throw out some stats, because there's going to be stats and answers and cards charge for everything. You're going to have to be able to explain with a narrative why, cost is more important versus innovation again and again and again with somebody who's done it 10 times before, just like you have.
This would be a good topic to have blocks prepared for, because there will be a stock case for each side. For the affirmative side, that prices are too high and people are denied access to health care. For the negative side, innovation. So if you can find a block that says that innovation will not go down, or if you can find some other way of saying that prices will not be too high or can be controlled in some other fashion, that would be very valuable to have in the round.
I agree with that, actually. And I think there's going to be sort of a depth to what you're blocking. I mean, you're not just going to write a block, say, answer to the claim, lowering costs is good. You're going to be writing blocks, for example, to very specific statistics, right? There are going to be statistics that we'll be talking about here that you likely will hear in your rounds, and you're going to want to be able to explain what the problem with that specific statistic and that specific study is. And that's the sort of granular level I think you're going to be operating at if you really want to be successful in something where the resolution, again, is forcing you into a pretty specific conflict where you don't have a lot of room to get out. Now, we will try to identify some novel, somewhat creative impacts and arguments, and we'll talk about those later. But I think overall, this is something where it's quality over quantity, depth over breadth, and that is the way we're going to come at this topic. So,
but not just depth. It's something that we have to focus on a lot in the style of debate that we do, is having depth, but being able to tell a simple story, and making what this very complicated and very deep thing is digestible in a 4-minute speech.
Yeah.
Right.
So with that, we will then move on next to framework, definitions, and concepts, which is coming up in just a second. So we're going to start out, as usual, by talking about some frameworks and concepts and definitions to sort of help frame the resolution, kind of understand what we're talking about. I do think on a topic like this that gets pretty deep into the weeds of economics, that it is important that we all kind of have a shared understanding of some of these concepts. I'll be honest with you, I've looked at some of the stuff that's out there in terms of stuff people are writing. Some of it's great, and I think people are very thoughtful about what they're writing. But one thing that really has not been addressed yet that I have seen that I really wanted to start with was understanding why drug prices are so high in the first place, and understanding that it's really not a function of a free market. It's a function of a monopoly system. And I've had a lot of people who I've talked to that maybe don't intuitively get this, so I thought it was worth walking through. So right at the beginning, you should understand the vast majority of drug costs in America don't come from drugs you buy, like Tylenol. You go to the grocery store, you go to the drugstore and buy those. They come from patent protected drugs, right? A patent is just this idea that we've had around for centuries that says you're an inventor, right? We want you to invent things. And so to give you an incentive to invent, we're going to give you the exclusive monopoly right to sell the thing that you invent in a market with no competition, right? That's the idea behind a patent. And the reason we do it is because, if you're an inventor out there inventing a device or a piece of software or a drug or whatever, and you didn't have this protection, then somebody else could just come in and steal it from you. Some big company could come take it and manufacture it. You wouldn't make any money. So for centuries, we've had this idea of a patent giving you a monopoly so that you can sell the thing that you have invented. Now, in the United States, drug patents in most cases are supposed to last 20 years, right? So they give you 20 years where you can sell your drug basically at whatever price you can get for it. Nobody gets to compete with you, right? And then after that expires, other manufacturers can come in and they can, assuming they can figure out how, and they typically can, right? They can make what's called a generic version of your drug, and then they can sell it at cost, right? So the price is going to come way, way, way down when the drug's patent lapses after 20 years. Right.
So for instance, whenever ibuprofen was first created, there was probably a patent on the chemical structure of ibuprofen for large-scale use. But now you can buy it over the counter pretty much anywhere. It's in everything because it's no longer patent protected.
Sure, yeah, and it may not be over the counter. It may still be a prescription drug, but the point is it's generic, and that's the term we use for it, which means it's going to be a lot less expensive because multiple companies are going to be able to come in and make it, and because there's competition, they'll sell it for whatever they can. And the statistics are pretty overwhelming, which is that in the United States, 89% of your prescription drug costs, or your prescriptions, are filled using these generic drugs that cost a lot less. but they only account for 26% of drug costs, which means that 11% of prescriptions are patented drugs, drugs where the patent is still in place, these monopoly drugs, and they account for 74% of all the drug costs in this country. So overwhelmingly, this very comparatively small number of patent-protected, relatively new drugs that where you can still charge whatever you want at this monopoly rate, right, is what is driving the cost of most pharmaceuticals in this country. And I haven't seen a lot of people talking about this or really understanding. And so you might say, well, Brett, you know, I took a basic econ course in 9th or 10th grade, and I remember hearing that monopolies are bad, right? Monopolies are bad because they drive up the price. If somebody has a monopoly on, you know, anything, diamonds, a commodity, some form of technology, anything, they can drive the cost way, way up. And in fact, pharmaceutical drug producers do drive the price way, way up. Also, in some cases, it drives the quality down. The FDA tries to control for that here, but monopolies are bad. So you might say, why don't we just abolish these patents, right? Abolish this monopoly we give them. Then they would all be generic drugs. The price would come way, way down, and we would be able to basically address the cost issue. And the reason is, we go back to the reason why we had these patents in the first place, right? It's to encourage inventors and creators, or, you know, big pharmaceutical corporations, if they're the ones who are funding the inventing process. It's to encourage them to continue to innovate, right? We let the person now who's invented something make a huge profit, potentially an obscene profit, like a lot of money, right? To incentivize the next person to go out and say, you know, I think that what I want to do is I want to try to invent the next great, like, life-saving drug, because I know that I also will be able to make a lot of money. And this is particularly important, as we're going to talk about later when we get into the contention level stuff, because frankly, inventing pharmaceuticals is super, super risky. The vast majority of pharmaceuticals, like 90%, over 90% of the ones that actually get started, like initiate the research and development process, never make it to market. Either they don't work, right? Or they're too dangerous, or for whatever reason, they don't make it through the FDA's drug approval process. And so what that means is, if you're going to go into the drug making business, right, you're going to, for every drug that actually works, right, for every drug that is successful and makes it to market and actually makes a profit, which not all of them do, you're going to have to make a lot of money, right, for this enterprise to be profitable. And you may say, and this, by the way, is one other thing I wanted to point out, you may say, well, you know, that's just bad that they're so greedy and that they're so motivated by profit. And I would encourage you, as you're getting ready to debate this, unfortunately, you kind of just have to lay that aside, because, right, the system that we have is a system where we kind of try to harness that greed, right? We try to harness the desire for profit. That's how we get innovation. We have these corporations that want to make all this money, and we use that to get innovation. So whether it's good or bad, right or wrong, whether you think you would go out personally and do this, you know, for no money, right, doesn't really matter, because the system that we have, and really the system that every country has for the most part, is we harness that sort of desire for profit for innovation.
Right, and the thing is, part of the reason why we also see so many new drugs come out of the United States is because we have that environment that's geared towards increasing innovation.
Yes.
Most new prescription drugs that come out into the world come from research and development that happens inside the United States or from the United States in some way or another. Because we've got the laws in place that allow patent monopolies to exist, because companies can take their big discoveries and make hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars.
Yeah, and the United States has made very deliberate choices in this regard, right? I mean, beginning in the 1980s, if you think of it as a spectrum, like at one end of the spectrum, we have, let's just have a complete free market, all the innovation you could want, drug companies can make whatever the market will bear, like whatever people will pay for a drug that saves their lives, which turns out to be a lot, right? We're going to go all the way over here, and what it's going to do is it's going to give us this very robust pharmaceutical industry. It's going to give us really high innovation. And frankly, one argument is the rest of the world is kind of free riding on us, right? The rest of the world has gone either toward the middle or even to the other end of the spectrum, where they control prices to one degree or another to lower their cost. They also have much lower innovation, but they say, what do we care? Just like some countries free ride on the United States for their national defense, right? They let us sort of pay for defending the world. They also free ride on us by us being willing to pay like the full cost of innovation. And so that's one complaint that people have. But I just thought it was really important to understand how monopoly economics work. I will tell you, we could go a deep dive into sort of charts and graphs about monopoly economics. I'll put some of those in the links. But suffice it to say, and I think this is an important point, I've been sort of talking about free market so far, but I think this is an important point for the pro, right? Most economists, if you ask them, will say that a certain amount of regulation of monopoly prices as a matter of economic theory is a good idea, right? Because if you completely leave monopolies alone and don't have any regulation whatsoever, you can get into some pretty bad situations in terms of price. So most economists, they would get into some very fancy terms, but they would tell you that that's a pretty common sense idea, that there ought to be some regulation on the prices that monopolies can charge. So anyway, I just wanted to talk about that generally. So I guess we can move now to kind of talking about like definitions of key terms. And I know, Alicia, you had some thoughts, I think, on price controls.
Yeah.
Right, but before we go into that, the first thing we need to talk about is that the United States federal government is listed as the designating actor.
Right.
So we're not talking about state or local governments. We're not talking about non-governmental organizations or reform within the pharmaceutical industry itself, but specifically the United States federal government imposing some kind of price control.
Yeah, I think that we should all be grateful for that. I know the LD folks are upset about the fact that they have no idea who's supposed to implement their resolution, so at least you have a clear one that you can use.
Right. Second of all, being like should impose shows that this would be a mandatory action. This wouldn't be any kind of opt-in, opt-out kind of system.
We're not asking pharmaceutical companies to lower their drug prices or to keep their prices.
This would be a requirement. As for price controls, the immediate thought that you might have, the intuitive thought would be a price ceiling, like a maximum price that you can charge for a certain drug or a certain class of drugs. But the resolution does not tell you what price controls are, and it leaves a lot of things unstated. Not only like how broadly they would be imposed, like would it apply to every drug, every class of drug, or only those that have exorbitant prices that are making the news. And then should a price control only be a price ceiling, or could it also be a price floor or some other means of controlling the price? Naturally, if you're the affirmative, you're going to want to have a very broad definition of what a price control is and want it to extend beyond a price ceiling. If you're the con, you're going to want your opponent to argue it straight up, give you a case that you can predict and respond to, which is what most people would think that a price control would be a price ceiling.
I think that, one issue here, and this goes very much to what you just said, is in a lot of the stuff that I've read on this topic so far, people are sort of lumping a lot of different things together into a category that they're sort of loosely calling price controls, right? But in reality, they're kind of, I think, conflating two very different things. When you actually look at the definitions of the phrase price control, like, for example, the Cambridge Dictionary, it says a limit set by a government on the price that can be charged by companies for particular products and services. The Macmillan definition says this, dictionary says the same thing. The Cato Institute says when a government adopts a price control, it defines the market price of a product, right? These definitions of the exact words price controls, I think, overwhelmingly suggest that the government is actually deciding on a price, or at least a formula of some sort for deciding the price. But when you look at some of the discussions online and some of these other places, people are talking about these other approaches, like, for example, using the market power that governments have, like through Medicare or Medicaid or the UK's health service, to sort of negotiate with these companies and say, look, we're a really big buyer. You should give us a deep, deep discount. Now, does that have the effect of lowering the price? It does, but if you look at most of the literature actually defining the phrase price control, they would say that is, while it does affect price, that's not a price control. That's more like using market leverage, so.
And I think a good way to just quantify that and like make it an easier example to follow is just saying, if the government decided to subsidize big pharmaceutical companies for their research and development costs, and that in turn made research and development cheaper, or companies didn't have to charge as much for drugs, I wouldn't consider that a price control.
No, absolutely
because
not.
You're just giving pharmaceutical companies money,
yeah,
and they happen to decrease the price because you gave them money.
So we're gonna put up a slide that I have here about sort of like what price control is. I would say that the consensus of the academic and policy literature out there is that price controls, by definition, are the government mandating a price formula, or a profit formula through some law or regulation. And then everything you see here in this blue box, right, is something different. Right, price negotiation using market leverage, like we buy lots of drugs for the Medicaid system, so therefore give us a better price. That's something different. It's not price control within the meaning of the literature. Things like patent reform, fixing patent abuses. That's not a price control, even though it affects the price. And really big changes that we're going to talk about later, like, for example, the Medical Innovation Prize Act, which would like use prizes to pay for pharmaceuticals. I know that sounds weird, but hear us out. We're going to talk about it later. Those are all different things. And here's why I think it matters. And this is what Alicia was saying earlier. Like, if you're the pro, you would like for basically anything that affects price to be considered price control. Even if you're going to use a pretty standard version of it in your case, you don't want the con to be able to come in and run these other things like negotiations, like patent reform, like prize act, that kind of stuff. You don't want them to be able to run those as sort of counter plans, or I guess you'd have to call them counter solutions because of the NSDA rules, but alternatives, right? You want to be able to sort of claim anything that is a price reduction, but the con is going to want to say, no, pro, you have to run price controls, being the government sets the cap. That's your territory. And anything else, right? Negotiations, patent reform, prizes, everything else, that's ground that we can use for an alternative, right? And so I think that debate about what is and what isn't a price control is actually going to be pretty important in terms of the framework. And as you can see, there's some literature here, for example, the one we've got on the slide about how basically there's price controls and there's negotiation, and they're fundamentally different. So I think that's something that you're, going to have to be ready to argue. So I guess the last thing I wanted to talk about kind of in the framework section is kind of structuring cases on this and how it might be just a little bit different. Well, actually, one more thing I wanted to say, which is we haven't defined all the terms. I do want to say I agree with Alicia saying that impose is, means the government has to do it. I think that actually the phrase, impose price controls, the word impose actually supports the idea that this has to be a government mandate, right? As opposed to, like, for example, negotiation or something. If the government imposes it, that means they sort of arguably that they unilaterally do it. So I think that that's pretty important.
There's some sort of policy or law in place that dictates a number or formula, like you were saying, to make a price.
Yeah, and other countries use other approaches. Like the UK uses a voluntary agreement. Like companies voluntarily agree to sort of limit their prices and work with the government. That's obviously not happening here, I don't think, anytime soon. But it is out there, but I don't think that's an option because it's not imposed. But anyway, in terms of structuring the pro case, I think one of the important things to remember is, honestly, both sides in this case have one really big predictable impact, right? And the pro's predictable impact is that drugs just cost too darn much, right? They cost too much. And there are lots of sub-impacts from that we'll talk about later. The obvious ones are death, suffering, costs to the patient, costs to insurance companies that spread, increased costs throughout the entire country, many, many different sub-impacts. But, I actually think in this case, because these impacts all stem from one very simple thing, which is just the fact that we've set the system the way it is, right? We don't regulate it. And there's really no dispute. I don't think anybody disputes. There's really nobody that
because we did it on purpose.
Right. There's nobody that denies, that the reason our prices are high is because we don't do what everybody else, every other OECD country does, and regulate them, right? So, I think that you honestly, I don't think, need three separate contentions that go claim and then some warrant and then some separate impact about, like, in other words, proving that it is the current status quo system that causes these impacts three times. I think you can pretty well establish that, with almost like running one big, like, mega contention that just says, look, here's all the reasons why prices are bad. Like, take a minute and a half or 2 minutes and just lay out all the deaths and all the costs and all of these things, and then, move on from there. But I don't think you have to sort of spend a whole ton of time, sort of laying out this assiduous case for why it is, the lack of price controls that leads to this high cost. I think almost everybody agrees with that. You should be ready to argue it, but I wouldn't spend like 3 minutes of my case reading evidence about, like, why it is, the lack of price controls causes higher costs and then do a few impacts at the end. I think that would be a bad use of time.
And I mean, like, if I'm a judge, I'm 1 minute into you going on to a rant about how drug prices are too much, and I'm thinking, yeah, like, I know, you can stop now.
Yeah.
Like, if you're on minute 3, I'm like, dude, what are you doing? Yeah. I already know that drug prices are too much. You didn't have to do this.
I will say that we have been looking at some approaches that other folks have, and some people are kind of reaching to try to get some, frankly, somewhat tenuous links. I've seen people try to argue, for example, that drug costs lead to a lack of manufacturing competitiveness, which leads to nuclear war. And, honestly, the links to these things are so very tenuous.
Or rural hospital closures lead to Asian conflict and global starvation.
I mean, you can try to do these things, but like the links are super weak. So, for example, if you were going to try to link to like this idea of we're going to lead to companies closing down because of healthcare costs, and that's going to lead us to have a weak military. Well, I have two simple questions for you. What country has had the highest pharmaceutical costs for the last, 30 to 50 years? Probably the United States. What country has the most powerful military in the world? The United States, right? So you're going to have to work really, really hard to show a plausible link that having high pharmaceutical costs when we've had them for decades, like the highest in the world, is going to somehow suddenly cause our industry to collapse when our economy is doing very well right now. And that's somehow going to lead us to have a military collapse, which is somehow going to lead to nuclear war. I just don't think that these sort of tenuous links are necessary here. I think the impacts are pretty clear. People don't get drugs and they die, right?
And that's a big enough impact as is.
Yeah.
Like, that's all the impact you need, and that's the most natural impact, so that's the one you should probably go with.
So anything else on framework do you think we need to talk about before we jump into the contention levels?
I
think we're good.
Okay. Well, then we will come back in just 1 second and actually get to the meat of the case and start talking about some contention level arguments.
So what we're going to do is look at some contention level analysis, and we're going to start with the pro side of the debate. And I'm not usually for this kind of thing, but this needs to be a topic that's heavy on the pathos.
Yeah.
And there's not necessarily good numbers on how many people die because of the lack of medications or because of the prices of medications, but just a simple Google search will give you hundreds of different people with their individual stories of cutting pills or having to sell something to be able to take their medication. So I would say open up with an attention getter of an 11-year-old girl or a 9-year-old boy and how their parents struggle to pay for their life-saving medication, and then segue into something that's more empirical. For instance, we have a source right here from the Kaiser Family Foundation that was published in The Oncologist in 2013 that says 1/4 of all cancer patients chose not to fill a prescription due to the cost, and about 20% filled only part of their prescription or took less than the prescribed amount. So if you can mount this kind of evidence and then also find some statistics on the death or find some statistics on people foregoing treatment altogether, just having the cumulative effect of showing that people are harmed by the circumstances.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is so important. Like, remember, you're a PF debater. Like, you chose to do PF, right? And I get that it becomes somewhat technical, and I know that in some places it looks like mini policy debate, but the truth is you chose to do an event where you're trying to influence, in many instances, lay judges, and we love lay judges, but like this, absolutely, Alicia is right. This is a case where you would be crazy not to have in your case anecdotes about like people who have cancer that can kill them, but they have a drug that could save them, but they are skipping, either not taking it or taking half of it, literally taking a chance of death, right? A significant chance of death because the cost is just too high, right? The cost is just too high. And you have, in the same, article, you have physicians at prestigious cancer centers like the MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston, Texas, saying, look, this is causing deaths. And even if we don't know the exact number, right? I mean, almost everybody, right? Almost everybody knows once you get to a certain age, somebody who's had to have one of these ridiculously expensive courses of treatment because of cancer at some point. And I think not having that in your case would be just like absolutely crazy.
Right. And I think that's one of the more important things, kind of like we brought up back in the past, is just making a simple story about what this debate is back to. The whole point of the resolution and the whole point of the affirmative side is to say drug prices are too high, so what's the main issue we're talking about? And that's affordability.
Yeah.
The entire purpose of the resolution is to bring prices down because right now they're not affordable. So if you want to go off of this idea of like, what are we talking about? There's one simple idea, and that's affordability. You need to hammer that home every single time because that's the most important thing.
Yeah.
The fact is, if people couldn't take insulin because it was $1,000 per shot that they have to take every single day, a lot more people would probably be dying of diabetes than they are right now.
Yeah, and I will say, now don't get me wrong, it's not that there aren't plenty of statistics. I mean, and we will certainly drop a lot of these in notes. You absolutely can find statistics that talk about how much this costs in terms of money. I mean, there's an article in The Nation that says it's, $50 billion a year, are coming straight out of consumers' pockets. 328 billion, this year. I mean, 328 billion, that's almost $1,000 for every single person in the country, right? And of course, not everybody is seriously ill, so that means a handful of people, a certain percentage, are really getting gouged.
Right.
But there's certainly huge numbers when we talk about, cost. And like I said earlier, you can just line these up in your case one after another. You can talk about anecdotes of people suffering. You can talk about billions of dollars in cost. You can talk about the fact that we are the only OECD country, the only major economically developed country that does not do this, right?
And I think that's an important point, is this idea that, sure, affordability is a problem, and it would be like understandable if people were paying a lot of money because it's just a necessary evil that we have to deal with. But
Right.
the fact is, people are paying exorbitant prices for something that drug companies are making profits off of. Drug companies are just like breaking even. They're not just covering their research and development costs. You need to hammer home the fact that drug companies are making huge record profits every single year because they're charging so much, because there aren't price controls.
Well, Josh, I'm actually glad you brought that up, because I think it's kind of important. You could spend your whole case going on and on about how expensive this is. Certainly, and there would be plenty to say,
Right.
but you wouldn't be getting like multiple, different forms of offense. You wouldn't be getting attacking the negative in multiple different places. One of the things I think you ought to consider is, because we know where the clash is on this resolution, like we know it's going to be affordability versus innovation, that I think it would be really smart to just go ahead in the affirmative case and go ahead and use some of your offense, like use at least one of your contentions to just go ahead and preempt the innovation argument, right? I mean, I would think, go ahead and have a contention that says, look, we don't need, this much, we don't need prices to be this high to pay for innovation. And there are a lot of sources out there that we can talk about, and, they'll be in the notes. But the one that I thought was the most worth talking about is the one that I'm going to pop up on the screen here, which is, we can talk about how much pharmaceutical research and development costs, and we can talk about incentivizing, research all day. But at the end of the day, you've got to have some numbers that kind of cut through the confusion. And the best one I found is this Yu and Helms article that is from 2017. And basically it says, look, it asks this question: do pharmaceutical companies really need to make this much profit, to make this much money in order to fund their research and development? Because con teams are going to keep saying it's expensive, it's expensive, it's expensive. We need all this money to do research and development. If we can't do that, then you won't get innovation. And if you look at this chart, it's amazing. This chart is mind-boggling. If you look down the right-hand column on this chart, what this is showing you is it's showing you like the amount that U.S. consumers, it's called the premium price. That's how much more we pay for each one of these. These are the top 15 selling pharmaceuticals. So we pay like 52% more for AbbVie, and 57% more for Amgen, and 64% more for AstraZeneca, right? And so when you take that premium, and you take just the amount of money that pharmaceutical companies make off of that premium, not how much money they make in the whole world, right? Not even how much money they make overall in the United States. Just the amount of money they make in the United States over and above what they would make if they sold it at the prices in other countries. In other words, the surplus that we pay, just that amount of money. That is what's reflected as in terms of a percentage of their R&D cost over in the right-hand column. So just that U.S. premium for AbbVie was 166% of its total R&D cost. Right?
Those are global R&D costs.
Yeah.
Domestic surpluses on premiums.
So when you look at Biogen, like 200, just the U.S. overage, just the surplus that they're making above what they'd pay otherwhere in the United States is 245% of their R&D costs. 159%. For example, poor Novartis here only got 97% of their R&D costs from U.S. overage. But when you add them all up, at the end of the chart, the very bottom, the circle in red, on average for these drugs, right, 163% of their R&D costs were made on just the excess price we pay here in the United States. Again, not the whole price, and certainly not the money that they make all over the world, just the excess price here in the United States. And so when people say we need this money for R&D costs, your response can be, no, you don't. right? They make 1.5 times their total R&D cost just on the surplus profit in the United States alone, without even considering the rest of the United States revenue and the rest of the world. It's just not true that they need this much money to cover their R&D cost, period, full stop. And I think it's at the end of the day, you're going to have to be able to cut the Gordian knot, cut through the mist, right, and make these arguments. And I think this is a great study to do that. Now, to be fair, if I were arguing against this, I would say, but look, these are the top 15 drugs, right? These are the top 15 drugs. They're like the LeBron Jameses and Steph Currys of the drugs. Of course they have to make a lot of money, right? Because as we're going to talk about later, a lot of these drugs lose money, or they never get approved in the first place. So these are going to have to make a whole lot of money. But if you notice, this chart actually controls for that, because what they're doing is they're not comparing it to the R&D budget for that drug. They're comparing it to the company's entire R&D budget, right? For all the drugs that succeeded and for all the drugs that failed.
And the fact is, because these are like the top 10, top 15 drugs, what that most likely means is these are the ones that people probably need the most anyway.
Well, they may be, or they may just be very popular. They may be, it's
either what the doctors are prescribing the most.
It'll either be what is the most critical to save your life, or what provides a lot of good to people, across the world, right? To many people across the world.
And if you want to make a further point, what you can look at is a 2008 study that found that on average, pharmaceutical companies spend almost twice as much on promotion as they do on R&D. So this is their marketing budget. It's double their R&D budget.
Yeah.
So if you really want to say that companies need just lower the cost of drugs, don't allow them to market, because that's where a lot of their money is going, not R&D.
Well, and there's actually a really strong argument there, because marketing, and look, I have my aunt is a really successful pharmaceutical rep. I don't think she's going to watch this video. If she does, I'm sorry, but your job shouldn't exist, right? No, I kid, but at the end of the day, we have a system in this country for prescriptions where doctors are supposed to use their considered judgment and tell you what you need to be healthy. And yet we are one of the very few countries in the world that allows direct consumer advertising of prescription drugs.
The advertisements tell you, hey, go ask your doctor about this drug. Go ask your doctor about AstraZeneca.
Yeah, it's like, jumping on what Brett said, the only other developed third world country that allows direct-to-consumer advertising.
Or third world country?
First world.
Excuse me. It's 10 o'clock at night.
Right, it is late.
Is New Zealand, and they also have disproportionately high drug prices like the United States.
Weird. Yeah. It's almost like there's like a correlation between those two things.
Yeah, but I mean, it's like, ask your doctor and this stuff. And look, at the end of the day, the idea of letting them advertise directly to consumers, it's easy to sort of sell a judge on the fact that that's nuts, the fact that they spend all of this money. Frankly, even the fact that they go around trying to advertise to doctors. In a perfect world, you'd say, look, you should just put the drug in front of the doctor with the statistics about how well it works, and the doctor should make the decision. You really shouldn't even be trying to sort of lobby them. They're professionals. Like I was an attorney before I came here. Nobody came to me and sort of lobbied me about like using certain, legal, well, they could, but I wouldn't listen to them. But at any rate, I think that's a great point, right? I think that's a really good point about, sort of advertising and cost. But I guess it just sort of goes to the larger point of, you're going to have people come in and say, this has to be the core of their case, right? We need, as the negative, as the con, we need this money to incentivize and to reimburse and to compensate these companies for their research and development. And you have to be ready with numbers and with logic and with theory and with an explanation of their business model. No, you don't. And you can't just do that like sort of logic, and you can't just do that about, well, innovation's, not that important. Yes, it is important. But what we're saying is you could do innovation with a lot less money than you're making right now. Right. Now, I think in addition to that, there are other pro impacts. For example, one I saw that I liked is the idea that, and is, pretty much everybody agrees that there should be some form of price control. Right. And remember, the pro does not necessarily have to come in and advocate for a really stringent, super low price control. We could get into some nice debates, I think, about how low does it have to be. I mean,
it could be 5%, and that counts as a price control.
Here's the thing: if you're the pro, can you come in and can you say, I want to lower? Let's be really extreme with it and say, I would set the price 1% lower than it is now. Well, I don't really think you get a big tactical advantage from that, because whatever benefits you get, like your costs are, whatever upside you get, your downside is the same. So for example, if you say, well, I only want to lower drug costs 1%, and that way we won't lose much innovation, fine, but you'll only lower drug costs by 1%. So in other words, I wouldn't spend a lot of time like trying to be super clever if I were the pro, and say like, well, I'm going to come up with some super clever, like small price cut or whatever, because at the end of the day, if your costs are small, your benefits are small.
Although I would say this, I found this thing from the National Bureau of Economic Research that says, cutting prices by a certain amount will decrease innovation by a certain percent. So, for instance, it says cutting prices by 40 to 50% in the United States will lead to a 30 or to 60% fewer research and development projects being taken place. But modest price changes, such as 5 or 10%, might only have relatively little impact on research and development. It says perhaps a negative 5%.
Yeah.
So I do think there is something about trying to find like a fine line as to what exactly these price controls could look like. So, maybe not 1% or 0.5%, but maybe not 70%.
Well, what that National Bureau of Economic Research says to me when I look at it is it says, well, if you lower it if you lower costs 40%, you're probably going to lower innovation by about 40%. If you lower it 5%, you're probably going to lower it by 5%. What that statistic says to me is, interestingly enough, coincidentally, however much you lower costs, you're probably going to lower new drug development by a similar amount. So, I don't know. I probably wouldn't, again, lose a whole lot of sleep over the exact amount, but it is worth knowing, the more you save in cost, the more you lose in innovation, according to most research. But the other thing I guess I was saying, and I kind of jumped off of it, was pretty much everybody agrees. Right? Donald Trump talks about how we need price controls. Democrats certainly talk about how we need price controls. Republicans are starting to come around on this idea. Most economists, like I said earlier, are pretty well on board with the idea that monopolies do need some kind of regulation of their pricing, right? And of course, every other country in the OECD does this. And sort of like we said last time with our video about Law of the Sea, we don't like to make arguments from authority and just say all the smart people are doing it, but here again, all the smart people are doing it, right? I mean, most of them are. And so if everybody else in the world thinks this is a good idea and we're the only outlier, then, maybe.
If everybody from your 9th grade, like your freshman high school year economics teacher to, every other country in the developed world can figure this out, chances are it's probably pretty true. There's a good chance it's true.
Yeah, I mean, so for me, honestly, when I think about how I structure it on the pro side, honestly, I can sort of see it running like this. I can see sort of a first contention that's pretty short, that sort of establishes the link between our lack of price controls, which exist everywhere else in the world, and our higher prices. Honestly, I think this is a very short contention. I can see a very long, like middle contention that just lays out in subpoint after subpoint after subpoint all the harms in the world, like all the ways this damages people financially in terms of their health. And if it were me, I wouldn't like go fast with it, but I would feel free to leave 4, 5, 6 different discrete impacts in there if they want to go chasing after those impacts. I think they'd be kind of dumb to try to do that. And then the last thing I might do is I might go ahead and use contention 3 to be my sort of preemptive, we don't need this high cost to do innovation contention, right? And that's just one way to do the case, but I think it could be an effective way to kind of structure it. I will say lastly on the pro, I do think that there are some somewhat weak arguments out there. For example, I've heard people talking about if you were to impose price controls, it would somehow reduce pharmaceutical companies' influence in politics, like their donations. There's 2 problems with that. The first is that pharmaceutical companies don't actually spend that. The idea is we're going to reduce their revenues, and by reducing their revenues, we're going to keep them from donating so much to candidates. The 2 problems. Number one, in absolute terms, they don't actually donate that much money. The entire industry put together donates about $2.5 billion per year to candidates, but which is about the price of R&D for one drug by one company, right? It's a lot of money in absolute terms, but for the industry as a whole, it's not a ludicrous amount of money. And number 2, and this is what's really ironic, if the government gets in the business of setting the price of drugs, do you think that the pharmaceutical industry is going to lobby them less or lobby them more? right? Because if it were me and the government said, okay, now we're going to have a board that sets your prices, I would...
They'd be trying as hard as they could to get someone on that board.
I would triple my lobbying budget like right then and right there. So this idea that we're going to somehow like, you know, reduce their hold on politics, look, nice try. Trying to come up with, you know, discrete, clever arguments. That's what debate is all about. But I just think that one like backfires like spectacularly.
I was about to say, yeah, con could honestly just use that as a contingent.
I would actually say you could honestly use that as a neg contingent, con contingent. So with that, let's turn and talk a little bit about what the con is going to be saying. So on the con, you know, right off the bat, I know some of you probably are a little bit, you know, hazy or sketchy about debating on the con side because, you know, you're very sympathetic to people paying a lot of money out of pocket for pharmaceuticals. It can be a little challenging. Another reason why it might be challenging is because, you know, of the nature of what you're trying to do in terms of measuring something concrete versus something in the future. But I will say, I actually like the con a lot. I mean, I have been surprised in my research about how much I think the con has some strong arguments as long as you're willing to sort of step back and understand the economics of how these drugs get made and how innovation happens. But the big challenge the con faces at the very beginning is when you're the pro, right? You are going to be debating about very concrete, clear, 100% guaranteed, quantifiable benefits if you affirm the resolution. We impose a price cap and we can count down to the dollar almost how much money people are going to save and how fewer people are going to go into bankruptcy and that kind of thing. Whereas if you're on the con, you are talking about the benefit of innovation, of developing a drug at some point in the future that will save some number of lives, but we don't know when, we don't know what that drug will do. It's somewhat speculative, and I'll be honest, that is somewhat challenging. But I don't think it is impossible.
Yeah,
right?
One of the biggest issues we have is when you're trying to determine what price controls would look like in the U.S., we really have nothing to compare it to. But what we can do is look at how the price controls in other countries affect people in the United States. And there's a 2018 report from Precision Health Economics, which is a health think tank, that found that if the price controls in other Organization of Economic Development countries were lifted, the number of new treatments available would increase 9 to 12% by 2030. And for an individual who's 15 today, that would add approximately 0.8 to 1.6 years to their life, which doesn't sound like a lot.
That's a
Question. Where did you say that source came from?
It's Precision Health Economics.
And what is that?
It's a think tank.
And where is that think tank from?
This think tank is...
I mean, are you trying to say basically that this is a think tank that works with the pharmaceutical industry?
Right. I think, and this is probably going to come up a lot, I think the issue with some of the sources you guys may be finding, and this is something that if I was a public forum debater on the Pro, I would do the exact same thing, be like, I don't know necessarily if the source that you're using should be reliable, because there are going to be a lot of think tanks that pharmaceutical companies provide or like pay money towards that are going to be putting out sources like the one that Alicia just mentioned.
But with this one, the thing that leads me to believe that this is a legitimate source is that they do have actual scientific staff, scientific advisors, people who have actually worked in drug development.
Okay.
But you see, this
are on this staff.
This is the debate you're going to be having, and I think both of these points are valid. Josh's point is right that I'll be honest with you, if you're on, especially on the con, the pharmaceutical industry has like large, well-funded trade associations that pump out studies and statistics and data and things like that look super reliable. But to be fair, they are clearly bought and paid for by the pharmaceutical industry. And it doesn't necessarily mean they're wrong. They could be right. They could be done by smart people. You just have to be ready to defend them, because if you're not, you could have the situation where you frankly get maybe potentially like embarrassed, by having somebody say, well, where did that come from? I don't know. Well, were you aware that it was paid for by the pharmaceutical industry and that they're just bad and they're evil? I mean, and especially in front of a lay judge, they'll be like, oh man, what a zinger, you just got really nailed on that. So you need to be aware, and what I would suggest is, when possible, try to find sort of nonpartisan, non-industry related groups. Published, peer-reviewed stuff when you can is always the smart thing, especially when we're talking about industry-funded research, which tends to get a bad rap. Or be ready to explain exactly why this particular source is reliable. It does come from people who know what they're doing.
So another one of the big impacts we'll be talking about on the con side is the issue of the lives that were brought up on the affirmative side. Basically, the affirmative saying that high drug prices are causing people to die prematurely. But you can actually turn that and make that a con argument by running a contention that says that when you have price controls, that slows the diffusion of new drugs to the market. And the source for this is The Hill in 2018. And what we see is that in the United States, where we don't currently have price controls, drugs get to market on average 90 days quicker than they do in Europe, so 3 months, and a year quicker than they do in Canada. And this can be directly translated to 600,000 lives that could have been saved if the drugs had made it to market quicker like they would have in the United States.
Well, and I think this is a really great point, which is that, whether you're talking about like how fast a given drug gets to market or whether you're talking about over the long term, whether there is innovation, I think as the con, you have to be super careful about not allowing this to turn into a debate about lives versus money. Like, you cannot be, as the con, about money for the pharmaceutical industry. You have to explain that innovation is about saving lives. I mean, you really have to say to the judge, look, 40 years ago, when you got AIDS, it was a death sentence, right? You were going to die. It was a question of how long you had. And 40 years ago, when you got testicular cancer, right, you were going to die, right? It was a question of how long. And thanks to innovations in pharmaceuticals for both of those illnesses and many, many others, those have gone from being a death sentence, right, to being a manageable illness that the vast majority of people can live with and can survive. And it's not a question of if we're going to have similar innovations in the future. We are, right? We do all the time. We have drugs that save people's lives all the time. It's a question of which illnesses it will be, how soon, how many lives. But, unless we just suddenly start getting really, really bad at innovation, like worse than we were in the 70s and 80s, then we're going to continue saving lives. And you have to emphasize that as the con. This is about, the sort of, 30 years from now when your kids are growing up, right? Like whether they are going to be safe from diseases that currently are deadly. And I think that's a really important thing to emphasize as you sort of go through the topic. So if you're going to be debating about why the pharmaceutical industry ought to be allowed to retain, significant profits, it is absolutely imperative that you understand the economics of how the drug development research process works. You have to be able to explain and justify why this is a necessary process and not just some grossly excessive situation where, robber barons are sort of, diving in their Scrooge McDuck money bin and laughing about how they're charging somebody $40,000 for a pill. And, to sort of start at the very beginning, the pharmaceutical industry is an incredibly risky industry, right? There's no other industry where you're going to pour huge amounts of money, billions of dollars into something that is very unlikely to ever make any money. But that's the way it works in the pharmaceutical industry. So if you look, for example, there's an MIT biostatic study from 2018 that says current numbers are only 14% of all the drugs that make it to clinical trials will ever be approved by the FDA and will ever make it to market. Right? And of course, not all drugs make it to clinical trials. I mean, many of them stop short of that. So some number below 14% of all the drugs that are ever sort of kicked off in the research process by these companies will ever even be approved to go out and try to make a profit. But then even the ones that are approved, there's this NBER study, I think it may be the same one you were talking about, Josh. It says that, only about 30% of the drugs that actually make it to market are ever going to actually make money. They're going to recoup their costs and make a profit. So, 30% of 14, you're talking about like less than 5% of all drugs, if you put those together, are actually going to end up making a profit, right? Now, some of those drugs are going to go on, to be extremely, extremely successful, and they're going to be, for millions of people. Others are going to treat very specific problems, like a particular form of colon cancer, and they're going to go to a small number of people. But in either case, they're going to have to make the money back. The pharmaceutical company, in order to function, in order to stay in business, these companies exist to make a profit. They don't do it as a charity, right? They're going to have to make a lot. Right? And so, for example, if you are investing an average of $2.6 billion into a drug, like $2.6 billion, and that is the average, like statistically, the average amount of R&D investment in a new drug to get it all the way through FDA approval is $2.6 billion. Well, if that's the case, you look at these crazy prices people are paying, like $100,000 or whatever, thousands of dollars for a course of treatment. Well, if you spent $2.6 billion on developing a drug, right? And you're only going to sell 100,000 of them in the entire lifetime of the drug because it's for a very rare condition, right? Then you're going to have to charge like $26,000 a treatment to break even. And people say, oh, this is crazy. I can't believe that. It's just a pill. It only costs, $4 to make or whatever. But what you're really paying for is not the pill. You're paying for somebody, this big, highly resourced company, to come and swoop in and do all this research and do all this development and testing to try and save your life.
But Bragg, if you'll let me jump in
Sure.
there. In many cases, you do have the pharmaceutical companies doing their own research and they have to recoup their costs. But in the majority of cases, this is from a National Institutes of Health study, they found that the underlying research that led to the breakthrough, that led to the medicine, was funded with public money. So in many cases, you do have companies that are not trying to recoup their investment. They just bought the patent from whoever discovered it at a university with public money, and they're just jacking up the price because they can. And this is what the resolution is trying to avoid. Yeah. So I just wanted to jump in.
Right, and I think one of the things that goes back to is the fact that the companies only do this and they only invest in this research because they know they can, because we don't have price controls right now. They know they can do this because they know they can make a profit back, or at least they think they probably can. But with price controls in place, they may not take this initiative and they might not do this research because price controls wouldn't allow them to get their money back.
Right, and we also need to talk about efforts that go beyond just recouping your costs. There's many allowances in our current drug laws that allow companies to make more money, extend their monopolies, and by less than ideal means. Some of these include paying for delaying, which basically, once your monopoly runs out after 20 years, if you pay the company that would manufacture the generic to wait to manufacture that generic, that's anti-competitive behavior. It's technically not prohibited, but according to an FTC study in 2016, this costs consumers $3.5 billion in higher drug costs every year.
And there's stuff like this all over the place. And
right.
I think Brett's got a point about what this stuff does and how these economic costs, like how much money pharmaceutical companies are making off of stuff like this.
Well, I think two things about what you just said. The first one is, as the con, right? Just like the pro had to address this question of like, do they need this money for R&D? You have to do the same thing as the con, because I mean, the core argument is ultimately going to be that these companies are making obscene, huge profits, right? At the end of the day, that's the real question. If they're making a lot of money, but they need that money to like do the R&D that they do to actually develop these drugs, that it's going back, then there's nothing wrong with it. That's just that's just how much it costs. It's unfortunate, right? But that's just how much it costs. And so, if you actually look at the data, and I have it from Forbes, and I'm sure it comes from other, sort of more fundamental sources that I'll try to drop in the notes. But, Forbes in January 2018 says, no, look, the pharmaceutical industry is actually not ludicrously, ridiculously profitable. It makes profits on average in the range of about 16% of a return on investment per year. And when you think about it, like if you were starting your own business and you said you're going to make 16% per year, like you're going to invest $100,000 of your own money, and then at the end of the year you'll have $116,000, would you say, well, that's just a ludicrous, obscene? No, that's like a totally reasonable amount of profit. In fact, for some people it wouldn't even be enough, and they're less profitable than like the beverage industry and the aerospace industry and many other industries. So the argument would be like, look, at the end of the day, the question is, could we get them to do this innovation for less? And if they're making like 100% profit, we would say, yeah, probably we could. But if their profit margin is a fairly normal 16%, it's kind of hard to argue that they're just profiteers and that they don't actually need this money for R&D.
What we do need to talk about is that many of the drugs that are being developed and brought to market and patented aren't new drugs. Yeah. A lot of them are drugs that already exist in the market with just minute changes. This is a process called evergrading. Basically, you change something minor like the coating on a pill, or just adjust the concentration a little bit. And this is quantified by a University of California School of Law study in 2015. And what they found is that between 2005 and 2015, 74% of new patents went to drugs that already existed.
Yeah.
So we're seeing we're paying higher prices for a product that's no better and that's not even new. Right. Certainly it's worth paying that much money for a product that will save someone's life that doesn't already exist, but we're paying this for things that already exist.
And what that boils back down to is something that we're going to talk about right now, is this idea of patent abuse and what we brought up in the very beginning of the speech, talking about the environment that the pharmaceutical industry exists in within the United States.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's sort of even more broad than that. I would say that, It's even more broad than patent abuse, actually. I would say that patent abuse and evergreening in particular are examples of sort of how the con might want to think about sort of alternatives, basically what you would call a counterplan if you were allowed to use plans. That's what we all called it, but we don't say it in the round. It's a
suggestion.
It's a practical solution, I think, is what the NSDA rules say. But for example, there are many ways, if the con can win the idea that a price control is simply a setting of the price, that it's not beyond that, then it has many other options. As Alicia points out, stopping this evergreening, which is like using the abusing of the patent system, like filing multiple patents on one thing and then trying to run them one after another, right? That would be an example of abusing the patent system. That's going to keep the drug in the monopoly status, keep the price high for an artificially long period of time. We should stop, the con could say, we should stop that. The con could say, you know, we should stop this pay to delay tactic where drug companies, their patent runs out, but they pay their competitors not to make the generic drug so that they, for at least for a little while, can continue making huge profits off of the drug. Those things drive up the cost for consumers with absolutely zero benefit to any innovation.
And zero reason other than drug companies want to make more
Yeah,
profits.
exactly. They don't benefit anybody. Those tactics don't create any new innovation. Stop those. But there are other examples. You know, for example, if you believe that negotiation is not a form of price control, if you win that definitional argument, then you could say we should do the same thing that the UK does with its National Health Service, and we should have Medicaid and Medicare actively use their size to negotiate discounts on drugs for the millions and millions and millions of Americans who receive their pharmaceuticals under those things. And this using of your size to leverage these companies is currently illegal under federal law. Like your Congress has a not just that we're not doing it, right? We had to go out and make it illegal to do. We couldn't just say we won't negotiate on your behalf. We had to make it illegal to negotiate on your behalf. But we have. It's unlawful for Medicare and Medicaid to go out and actively negotiate and try to say, look, we buy millions of pharmaceuticals, give us a 30% price break. They could absolutely do that.
Because the VA does it.
The
If you
VA
want to
does
look
it.
and see the efficacy of it, like the VA saves lots of money every year. And that if you want to anticipate the counter argument you'll get from the affirmative, they'll say, well, there'll be fewer drugs available. There are sources, VA doctors, that say we can get pretty much every drug we need and we get it for cheaper than you do on Medicaid and Medicare.
Right, exactly. And so that's another alternative. So one is reforming the patent system. Two is using negotiation. A third one that I love, I think, guys, this may be the ace in the hole.
And you're going to have to like really wrap your brain around this. It took me a little bit to understand
Yeah,
it, but it's really good.
We'll drop these in the links, but this is a really strong con argument. If you believe that you can run an alternative, it's the idea of using a prize system for pharmaceutical innovations. Now, hear me out. I know this sounds crazy. Like, I know you're picturing like handing somebody a little plastic trophy and saying, good job saving people from cancer. That's not what it is. There are numerous law professors and there are numerous examples of this being introduced in Congress. As a matter of fact, it was introduced by Bernie Sanders in 2007. It was called the Medical Innovation Prize Act, right? And there are multiple examples of law professors who've written articles. And the idea is this. It's very simple. We understand that pharmaceutical companies need to make a lot of money to incentivize them to go and innovate, right? But the problem is it's coming out of the pockets of poor and working class people. The regular, guy who works in a factory or whatever, who just works a daily job, he gets cancer, he has hundreds of thousands of dollars of bills for experimental treatments. It's not so much that we as a society can't afford to pay billions of dollars to incentivize these drugs. It's that we don't want this guy paying it, right? And so what the prize system would do is very simple. Instead of giving drug companies a patent where they can go out and charge you for your drugs, what they would do is they would take essentially the same amount of money that we pay to drug companies. They'd look at the market and figure out how much that is, and they would put that money in a pool, and then they would appoint us a pool of experts, like a panel of experts, like they have in the UK. The UK already has one of these. It's not, they don't use prizes, but they use it for a different purpose. But they'd have a panel of experts, and basically they would look at how effective the drug is, right? And they would award a prize of millions or billions of dollars to the pharmaceutical company as what it would have made in the market. So you get the advantage of the pharmaceutical company still gets the money to do innovation. They still get the incentive, right? we still pay for it, but it's not the poor and working class folks that are paying for it. We're paying for it using like this progressive tax system where we use the income tax, which is mostly paid by wealthier people. We use the corporate tax, which is paid for by corporations, and we spread the cost across all of society instead of having a few unlucky people who are working class folks have to do it. A lot of law professors, a lot of people believe that this is by far the most rational way to do things. And if you want to be kind of sharp about it as the con, you can run two contentions that just say, we don't need to do this, we don't need price controls, but you could run a third one that says, but hey, you know what? If you think we do need to lower costs dramatically, there's a much, much better way we could do it, and that would be to have a system where basically we centralize payment, through the federal government, because that will have all of the upside of saving these people from catastrophic cost. It will have all of the upside of improving access to drugs so that pretty much anybody can get them, and none of the downside of lost innovation. We'll just have to pay for it in taxes like we pay for everything else.
But the fact is, and people are going to say, oh, well, we're paying for it in increased taxes. The fact is, you're going to be paying for it one way or another. It's either through increased taxes and we get all the benefits of innovation, or it's because you pay higher insurance premiums because you let pharmaceutical companies charge whatever they want.
Right. That's another, exactly, because, when you, exactly, so to go to the sort of back to the pro side of things, the point would be that, even if you don't get colon cancer, right, you're still paying for these exorbitant $100,000 colon cancer therapies and drugs.
Now, everyone has to pay.
Everybody pays for them through their insurance, because when your insurance covers it, they spread that cost out in premiums into everybody, right? And so everybody ends up paying for it. The last thing I want to say about the con, and I think this is sort of, two things, right? Two general observations that I would try to work into my con case, which are these. Number one, the benefits of the costs of innovation are unfortunately borne by Americans, and that's bad, and we shouldn't gainsay that. But the benefits flow to all of humanity, right? So I know that's not an easy thing to sell to like voters, but if you sell your judge on the idea that you should do what's best for all of humanity, then you would say that like once these innovations happen, they belong to the world, right? They can be sold to anybody in countries that have price controls and don't, and everybody in the world benefits from getting these innovations. And so sadly, but truly, even if we end up paying more as Americans for it, if everybody in the world has these drugs forever, right? That's a huge net benefit to the world. The second thing is about the time frame right here. So remember, these drugs that we pay so much for are overwhelmingly pharmaceuticals that are patented. And these patents, unless they're abused, expire after 20 years, right? So in a sense, what you would say is like the cost of not lowering the price now is not trivial. It is significant. We do lower access and we do have to try to find ways around that and things like that. But the cost of stopping a drug from being developed, right, might be that we never cure this disease, or at least we don't cure it for decades,
and
right?
Tens, hundreds, thousands, millions of people die.
In other words, the costs of to people right now of the situation with no price controls, they're immediate and they happen now, but the benefits are forever, because once you incentivize this innovation and you create this drug, the benefit of that innovation and drug lasts for as long as human beings exist.
Since penicillin has existed,
as long
it's
as
benefited
penicillin will benefit the world forever, right? And it will benefit everyone in the world forever. So one general observation the con can make is, look, even at the end of the day, you're not really sold on my statistics or whatever. Just remember that the benefits they're talking about accrue for at most 20 years while this patent is in place, right? And they accrue only to Americans, right? Whereas the benefits to our system of innovation are going to accrue to everybody in the world for the rest of the existence of humanity.
The biggest impact, because it's literally just infinity. Until the inevitable heat death of the universe, we're going to see these benefits.
And so for those of you out there who are just addicted to these crazy impacts, how about instead of doing these nutball link things where you just like these crazy link things where you try to link everything to nuclear war. If we don't do price
controls, we're going to see increased conflict in Asia.
I mean, things where the links are just ridiculous. Why not actually do the link to a logical point, which is that these innovations will last forever? That's a huge impact, and it's real, and it's tangible, and it's logical, and you don't need to make links between farm production and
cite 18 sources in a Reddit page.
And somehow we're going to go from having the strongest military in the world to just freaking out over like our farm production, and we're going to go invade China. It's
because
just
Joe Schmo had to get rid of a rural hospital or something like that.
And moreover, you're not going to say this to like a policy judge with a CETA shirt on. You're going to say it to somebody's mom, right? Who just got off off work to come judge you because this is PF. Yeah, that's a great strategy. That's just brilliant. But anyway, sorry, that's my rant for the day. Do y'all have anything else on Colin?
No, I mean, I think this is pretty solid. Just remember, it boils back down to a pretty simple argument of affordability versus innovation.
Right.
Don't get too in the weeds. If you do get in the weeds, know what you're talking about.
Yep. All right, so with that, we'll come back in just a second and do a few parting thoughts.
Okay, so in your final speech, you're going to want to have some voting issues for your judge. Just bring all the stuff that you've talked about back into 2 or 3 reasons why they should feel confident voting for you. And one of the ways I like to do that in PF is with a cost-benefit analysis, just bringing everything back into perspective. So for this one, this is really coming down to drug prices and accessibility of healthcare versus innovation. But what we need to think about is how big of an impact we could even have. The New York Times in 2015 says that prescription drugs are only 10% of America's total healthcare costs. So that means even if you cut prices by 50%, that only reduces total healthcare costs by 5%. But you contrast that with, we've had a decade of unprecedented innovation that has the possibility of saving thousands of lives. It's clear that you could have more impact on the innovation side, or you could make the opposite case and say that lives saved.
And I think that's basically what it's going to boil down to, is going back to the big picture, bringing everything back to what exactly it is we're talking about. Because at the end of the day, after every single round, there's going to be dozens and dozens of stats and numbers that are going to be thrown at you. You're going to throw at your competitor, and all of it's going to be thrown at your judge.
There's no way that this round can happen. There is just no way without a math fight. I mean, that's what I get. There's just going to be a numbers fight every single time. No way to do this round without that.
And the fact is, you and your opponent have seen these numbers a lot, especially towards the end of the month. You're going to see that, well, you know all these sources. Your judge might not. Your judge may be seeing this for the very first time.
I'm sorry to keep interrupting, but if you're the kind of person who comes in and goes, just remember what the Smith 14 evidence says. They don't know what the Smith 14 evidence says. Right? What you need to say is, remember when I told you that they spend $2.6 billion developing a pharmaceutical, or whatever the number is. Do not, unless this person is like a former TOC debater and they've got like a TOC t-shirt on, right? Do not go in tagging the cards that way. Tell them what the stat is and explain why it matters.
And not you need to be doing all that, but don't just wait until the final focus. Don't wait until your last speech to be doing all this. You need to be summarizing. The key verb here, then Brett was talking about this earlier, is just explaining to your judge the simple fact of why your economic policy, why what you're talking about makes more sense and is better than what your opponent is saying. Make it really simple. Don't do it in your final focus. Do it towards the end of the round. Get it in your judge's mind. Really incept that in there and have it stick.
Incept it. I like that. We're going to be incepting these judges, and they're going to be like writing ballots about ballots within their ballots, so whatever. But listen, at the end of the day, as we said at the beginning, this is a topic that is going to be about depth as opposed to breadth. We are going to see the same things come up again and again. And yes, people will try to get a little clever. Maybe you will get clever with some of these alternative counterplan type things, or maybe you'll do something else. But for the most part, you're going to fight the same battle again and again. You cannot win it by just throwing out numbers. You must win it by having a depth of understanding. This is the kind of case where when we link to these things in the notes, and when these other folks who write about this, very good people out there who write about debate, when they link you to stuff, read the article, right? Actually go and read the article. Don't just go and pull the 4-sentence block or the 4-sentence quote and put it on a card, or it's already on a card. Actually go and read it. The time you spend actually diving into this and developing an understanding so that you can stand up in a grand crossfire and just dominate your opponent with, I'm sorry, you just don't understand the economics behind how this works. Let me explain it to you.
And be able to explain it simply enough that your judge understands
politely and nicely and simply, and just make it so that people understand it. When you develop that depth of knowledge from actually reading, not just cutting cards, you're going to be better off on this. Oh, and again, I think it's a good topic. It's a challenging topic in exactly the opposite way of last month's, but we wish you all the best of luck. Happy Halloween, happy Thanksgiving, happy holidays until we see you next year. But at the end of the day, as we always say, remember, debate is supposed to be fun. So have fun, work hard, hail state, and we will see you next time.